team.
Hey there, this is Malorian, and this is the Orc Tactical Team. Now, what we're going to be talking about today is actually in the way that the power level of different armies can be changed. Now, when I first say that, probably the first thing that comes to mind is, okay, what's determining the strength of the armies? Oh, well, what's the comp? Is there something banned? Is there limits on certain units or items? That's probably the first thing that comes to mind. After that, you're probably thinking about, well, what about the scenarios? Is there going to be a watchtower? Is it blood and glory? Is it something special? That'll really change what army is going to do better or worse. But one of the things that people almost always forget about, or just don't even really think about to begin with, is the whole idea is what's the point size? And of course, if it's something like, oh, is it 2,000 or is it 2,100? That's not going to change it so much. However, if you get some of these larger swings where, normally you do 2,000 and now you're going to do 2,800, or maybe someone's doing like a smaller one, it's going to be 1,000-point games or 1,200 or whatever it is. Once you start seeing those differences, all of a sudden it can make a really big difference on what armies are going to be doing better compared to others. Now, probably the first thing to talk about when these is which one's going to have the most balance. And really, when you start looking at the smaller point games, you see a lot of paper, rock, scissors. And why that is because, hey, if I took a big block of ethereal, oh, you don't have a magic weapon in your 1,000 point list, guess what? These guys are just going to walk right through you. Or maybe I took a Terrorgeist. Oh, you have no way to shoot him down? Guess what? He's just going to jump around and scream you to death. Whereas once you get to the larger size of games, well, all of a sudden then people usually have their full toolbox and they can deal with these things, right? Oh yeah, I got a character with a magic weapon. He'll kill those ethereal guys. Oh yeah, now I have my war machines and shooting. They can deal with all those flying monsters. No problem. So you see that really kind of even out in the larger games. Now, granted, you do see skew lists more in the larger games too. So maybe that could be like, hey, the guy that in 1,000 points took as many ethereal as he could, he can really take a lot of ethereal when you get up to 3,000 points or something like that. And so really, though, between the two, you really find that whereas in the small point game, that paper, rock, scissors is a straight up, I just can't deal with that. Whereas, like I said, in the larger point games, you have that toolbox, and those things, they can do well, but it's now mitigated. Or another thing too is, you just know that over the tournament that at some point it's going to go wrong, and you're going to be losing that. So what I really find is that, hey, if you want to try and work that with the small point games, try and find your rock, your paper, or your scissors, and really just go with it, because those ones are going to do very well. So like I talked about, there'll be things like, oh, I'm going to be going with my ethereal or my Terrorgeist, stuff like that. But another part of it too is the play style. One of the biggest ones is avoidance type armies do very well at smaller point games. And what that really comes down to is that even though, one game might be 2,400 and another one is just 1,200, more often than not, I see it still being played on the same 4x6. And that just means that army is smaller and still has the whole board to run around and do their thing. Meanwhile, when you are playing the larger games, well, now there's more models on the board, you can't always get around them, and they also have all the tools to shoot you down and all the rest of it. So that means armies like Wood Elves, Lizardmen, High Elves, Dark Elves, blah, 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 they can do very well at those smaller point battles, whereas in the higher ones, that avoidance type thing just can't work as well. So that's definitely something to look at. Now, with that too, a big thing comes down to is how strong is your core. Now, in the larger point games, you can put in that horde of trolls. You can put in that horde of black orcs because you have the points to actually make them that fully effective unit. When you go to the smaller point games, you just can't take that many, and there's a lot of units like that that need to be a larger size to actually be effective, such as like black orcs. When there's a horde of black orcs, they're going to crush whatever they're fighting. When it's a smaller point game, and we're talking like a unit of 15, all of a sudden some little losses or whatever, they're not really getting many attacks back, they're not going to do well, and they're not nearly as effective. So what people will see instead is they're going to be moving to their core. That really does the same thing that you have in the larger point games, but now that those elite ones aren't really an option, they're just that much better. So some armies, like orcs and goblins, they're great with that, right? My Savage Orc Biggins did great in the big game. They'll do just as great or better in the smaller game. Another one, too, could be like the Warriors of Chaos. very strong core, fantastic. They can just do their thing there and, cut things up. Now, some of the ones that won't do well is the ones, of course, that have weak core. So if we're talking about something like, the skeletons and the zombies and things like that, unfortunately, they're not going to do that well at the smaller point games. While we're talking about those, another thing that's going to really suffer at the smaller point games as well is armies that really depend on synergy. Whether it's something where you really need to have all these parts together to make it happen. For example, the Tomb Kings, where a lot of Tomb Kings are based off lots of magic. And so you need all your different components in there to really max out the magic phase, or also maybe have all the shooting and the 2 Skullpults and all these things. Oh, you also know your stuff dies really easy, so you need a Sphinx to keep them back. Well, guess what? If it's a small game, you just can't really get all that stuff in there. You have to kind of depend on your core, and they're not going to do very much for you. So, meanwhile, somebody that doesn't really need synergy and where things can work all by themselves, say more like, elves and stuff like that, they don't care, right? If we're small units having to do our own thing, we don't really need the super synergy. We're good to go. Part of that, too, would also be leadership armies. If you have a low leadership, it can be a real challenge at the smaller point games because maybe you can't afford to get that lord to get the good leadership on your stuff, right? All of a sudden, whereas, elves or dwarves, well, they're already leadership 8 or 9 anyway. But if you're looking at Skaven or at, orcs and goblins, especially if it's a goblin army, you could be in a lot of trouble in these smaller point games if you don't have the room to get that lord in, or even if you do, it's going to be harder to protect him and actually keep him alive. So that could be a really big issue. Probably part of that, too, is going to do with the whole people that need to depend on magic. And with this as well is a whole idea where magic really changes from the bigger style games to the smaller ones. In the smaller point games, magic can have a much larger effect. Now, we've all seen it where in the larger games, somebody does Purple Sun and just kills off like a whole horde of trolls, and it's a huge swing. Well, just imagine the smaller point games where the units are smaller, there's fewer models on the table, you get one good spell out there, game over. That's it. And oddly enough, one of the best spells you start seeing in these smaller point games is the common fireball. Here you have it. You can have it on a level 1. You'll always have that. You can 6 dice that super fireball, and it can just devastate a unit all by itself. And so magic you find to be very, very critical at that smaller level. Sometimes you can get away with not taking magic, but man, that one game that you don't plan for it can be absolutely devastating. Whereas in the larger point games, hey, you might go for your one big spell. I'm going to scroll it. If you do destroy this unit, I still have 3 more, whatever. Meanwhile, the smaller one, oh, you get off that one fireball. All right, my big combat unit's gone, and I got almost nothing left. So that's pretty much all of it. You can piece these things together, what's going to do better where. Things like orcs and goblins, they do very well in the smaller point games, more so with orcs. If you're going more with goblins, yeah, you need to have a larger style game so that you can actually have that leadership in there and all the rest of it. But it can also be a thing, too, where you run out of toys, right? Something like Knight and Goblins can actually do well at smaller point levels where, okay, I can really surprise you with my my fanatics and stuff like that, and then you don't have too much to fight against me. Meanwhile, in the larger point games, I still have the same tricks. It's just more of the same. And if you have that one throwaway unit, it comes in and it just, all right, my own tricks are being used against me. So again, it's one of these things where almost like the skew list. You have to be looking at the number of tricks that an army uses and how diverse they are. And of course, we're looking at right there Night Goblins, which is like one unit out of an entire book. But hey, then again, people do make entire armies out of just Night Goblins. So there you really have it. Just something to really keep in mind that whenever you're going to a tournament, look at the comp, look at what scenarios they might be playing, look at what scoring system they're going to be doing too, but also, make sure to look at those points because that can really change the way that some armies might do well and some armies might have to struggle. So there you go, and thanks for watching. Bye.